Gender and the Union is a podcast exploring why policy changes matter in combating gender-based violence in the European Union, and why relationship and sexuality education is key to creating a more equal and safe future for all. In this 4-episode podcast series, we will create a dialogue between policymakers in the EU and the young people looking to advocate for positive change. Hello, and thank you for joining us for this episode. My name is Catherine Bailey Gluckman, and I'm a Programme Advisor with the IPPF European Network. I'm here to discuss what the European Union and all of us in it can do to create a society free from sexism and discrimination, with the EU Commissioner for Equality, Helena Dally, and our sexual and reproductive rights advocate, Amanda from Sweden. During our conversation, you may hear various acronyms. The most important one to note before we start is SRHR, which we use as a shorthand for sexual and reproductive health and rights. So, to our guests, Helena Dally is the first person to hold the position of EU Commissioner for Equality, a portfolio created in December 2019. Her role is to strengthen Europe's commitment to equality and inclusion in all of its senses. Prior to taking up this role, she held a comprehensive range of political responsibilities in Malta concerned with equalities, women's rights, and civil liberties. She gained her PhD in political sociology and has held university lectureships in economic and political sociology, public policy, and the sociology of law. Amanda is a member of RFSU, IPPF's member association in Sweden, and she's based in Malmö. She's 23 years old and has roles in the organisation related to governance. She's an elected representative, in education, and in event coordination. Her activities over the past 2 years include leading relationships and sexuality education for young people nationally and locally, and in the last year, she has also begun to work as a course leader, training other sex educators to do the same. This year, she is the lead producer of her local chapter's participation in Copenhagen 2021 World Pride, where SRHR and comprehensive sexuality education will be the main themes of the activities she's coordinating. Thank you both very much for joining us. We are delighted to have you both with us today. Let's start with this topic of gender equality as a European value. We know it is close to the hearts of European citizens, 91% of whom believe that promoting it is important to ensuring a fair and democratic society. Helena, can you tell us what is the European Commission doing in terms of diminishing gender inequalities and ensuring people can lead lives free from sexism and all forms of discrimination?
Well, gender equality is a key priority for the Commission, and charity begins at home. And as you pointed out, for the first time in history, the Commission has a Commissioner for Equality, and also for the first time in history, the College of Commissioners is fully gender balanced. Also, when you look at the gender equality strategy, which we presented last year, you can see that, a gender equal Europe where gender-based violence, sex discrimination, and structure inequality will become a thing of the past. That is the aim of this strategy. It is a strategy where we have to see a Europe where women and men, girls and boys, in all their diversity, are equal and can thrive, because as we know, where there is discrimination, people cannot thrive, people cannot reach their full potential. Therefore, for us, it is of the essence that we build a Europe where there is this equality and where people are free to pursue their chosen path in life, and where they have equal opportunities, and then where they can equally participate and lead our societies. We've had the first year of implementation report of this gender equality strategy, and the report shows us that progress in the EU slowed in some areas, and partly explained by the gendered impact of the pandemic. As you know, the pandemic had a disproportionately gendered impact on women, especially for women in situations of domestic violence, for instance, where many women and girls were trapped in households with their abusers. Also, many women were frontline workers in supermarkets, in care work. So even there, this had an effect on their mental health. So that is why we say that progress was slow during this past year. And it shows also, this report shows us how crucial it is that we continue the efforts in implementing the actions which were planned for gender equality in spite of the crisis. And now we look at it as part of the recovery. We are looking at the recovery from this gender perspective, from the perspective of how women have been affected. But also this year we addressed it, to continue answering your question on what is the Commission doing. We addressed equal pay and to tackle pay discrimination, that we have made the proposal on pay transparency, which we see it as an important step towards addressing the gender pay gap. We have also ambitious targets for women's participation in the labor market and the provision of early childhood education and care, with the action plan to implement the European Pillar of Social Rights. We are also working with member states on the work-life balance directive to see that there is this equal sharing of responsibilities. Now that this is a directive, the next step, of course, is to work with member states and to see how they are implementing this directive. We also had the Gender-Based Violence and Online Violence, or the Digital Service Act, making the internet safer for women especially. We have also worked on better access to protection and support for victims, presented the first ever victim rights strategy. We're also preparing a specific legislative initiative to better support victims and prosecute perpetrators of gender-based violence. And of course, we continue to invest a significant amount into projects preventing gender-based violence or supporting its victims under our funding program for citizens' equality, rights, and values.
Thank you very much. You mentioned there a number of tools for translating these strategies into the tangible construction of an open and equal society. We know that a very important one among those tools is education. And you mentioned the impact of COVID on increasing the likelihood of people experiencing gender-based violence in Europe as a recent and urgent issue. It's becoming increasingly well recognized that if we educate children and young people about gender equality, we can prevent violence. When we offer them transformative alternatives to sexist ideas about normative femininity and normative masculinity, then we reduce sexual and gender-based violence, all kinds of harassment and bullying. Amanda, this kind of sexuality education is obviously the core of your engagement with SRHR, and you're working in a range of ways to maintain good access to it in Sweden. Please could you tell us what your own experience has been with access to relationship and sexuality education?
Yes, thank you. This question is a very complex one, because although sexual education has been compulsory in schools for almost 70 years in Sweden, there's still a lot of work to be done in the field, because it doesn't help to have good curricula and laws that give students the right to compulsory CSE if it's not implemented in practice, which I personally have experienced the consequences of. For example, although sex education is obligatory for pupils in schools, sex education is not compulsory for those studying to become teachers. And a survey that EDFSU carried out in 2004, and we also did one in 2016, showed that only 6% of those studying to become teachers had received some form of sexuality education. And this inevitably affects the quality and width of the sex education that the pupils in our schools received. And I'll get into the specifics of the consequences later, but the notion of not giving our teachers the tools to teach is rather absurd, really. So would we, for example, trust teachers with no knowledge of math to teach their students math? Probably not. So in summary, the access to relationship and sexuality education is very, very good on paper, but the practical implementation needs a lot of work. But a major step towards improving this has been made just this year. So this spring, the Swedish government decided on new writings in the curriculum for sex education. And in practice, this means that sex education will become compulsory for students studying to become teachers. And the new curriculum also takes major steps towards a sex education focusing on sexual health promotion, which I'll also get into later.
Thank you. That is a very important point you make about the potentially big gap between the existence of legislation and tangible action to implement it, to make sure that citizens can benefit from the existence of that legislation. This recent step taken to make sexuality education training a fundamental part of school teachers' education is a vision of fantastic, continuous, positive development in good sexuality education. In contrast, on the day of our recording here, it has been a dark week for SRHR and anti-discrimination advocates across Europe, as we've just seen Hungary pass a law that bans any discussion of the lives of LGBTQI people in schools. This homophobic, transphobic move means a terrible narrowing of education for all young people and represents a complete failure to see the wider societal benefit of comprehensive relationship and sexuality education. Amanda, based on your experience, what do you think the Hungarian government has fundamentally missed here in terms of the holistic impact of CSE? In other words, what changes do you see in young people's lives when they have access to inclusive relationship and sexuality education?
The changes are, of course, enormous. They feel empowered to make decisions, to care for themselves, to lead happy and safe love lives. They get an ability to recognize and address abuse when it happens. They understand consent, they set boundaries for others and themselves. They can deal with bullying, they can protect themselves from coercion, they can stand up against oppressive structures and understand equality and therefore protect others from harm. And that's where I feel like competent, queer inclusive relationship and sexuality education is so important, because it makes young people truly understand the world and the people within it. And with understanding comes love and respect. And this naturally ties into working with sexual health promotion as a method for reaching these effects, as we know good CSE results in. So CSE is an abbreviation for comprehensive sexuality education. And if I just can briefly mention my own experience, they also differ from the things that I like to see in good comprehensive sexuality education. I remember, for example, my compulsory sex education like any other biology lesson. So we were only given very clinical information about how the body works, how condoms worked, and how pregnancies happen, basically. So we did not get the information that we actually need, like the ones regarding what sex is and how it feels like, and what queer sex is, and what gender identity is, what consent is, and how it could look, and how sex is something that should feel good and not be something mandatory that you just must do, or because having sex is a choice, and if you have it, it should feel good. And this is an experience that I unfortunately share with the majority of my generation, and this has major consequences for young people and adults' lives. And if we have an availability and access to good comprehensive sexual education, its effects are in fact enormous, as we have discussed.
So it's very obvious in your experience that decent sexuality education should go way beyond biology and does in fact encompass building the skills that are necessary to navigate all kinds of social relationships, intimate relationships and wider relationships. They should enable people to understand and live out the basic principles of equality. An important tool that we have discussed in our previous episodes for promoting equality and helping protect all people in society who are otherwise vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence is the Istanbul Convention. But 10 years after its creation, its ratification is not advancing at EU and national level. We're seeing some countries blocking it, and some are even taking steps towards withdrawing from it entirely. Due to this stalemate, the European Commission has proposed to draft a directive on gender-based violence, which, if adopted, would be binding for EU countries. Helena, could you tell us more about why the implementation of the Istanbul Convention is so important and how this new directive could help with that?
Well, to me, the Istanbul Convention is the gold standard when it comes to the protection of women and girls in situations of gender-based violence. And freedom from violence through strong legal framework to prevent and protect from gender-based violence, and as well as to prosecute perpetrators, of course. So the Istanbul Convention is the most comprehensive and effective legally binding instrument we have at international level to combat violence. And it does so dismantling prejudices and stereotypes and ensuring protection to all women and girls without any discrimination. So implementing those standards can save the lives of millions of women and girls. And that is why EU accession remains a priority for us. On the Commission side, then, we do not remain inactive because, as you rightly pointed out, there are 6 member states who will not ratify the convention, and we need unanimity, and thus we cannot ratify the convention if we don't have this unanimity. So we are preparing a Commission legislative proposal to prevent and combat gender-based violence, which we will present by the end of this year. What is important is that there will be the same objectives as the Istanbul Convention. As I said earlier, I consider the Istanbul Convention to be the gold standard. So obviously we have to emulate that, and it will ensure that EU member states have effective measures in place in areas of EU competence, of course, on these matters. I mean, there are ongoing preparations right now, and we are planning to have this legislation by the end of the year.
And do you see a place for access to relationships and sexuality education as a component of this new directive?
Yes, especially since we can see a lot of violence which is due to ignorance in the sense of ignorance on the subject. For instance, if I were to point out something which I had done previously, some research on myself, whereby young boys and girls, because of a lack of sex education and proper sex education in schools, as you and Amanda have been saying, they use porn as sex education, which can have very serious consequences, in the sense that pornography, what children, when there's data which shows that boys start watching porn at 8 years and girls at 11 years, generally, and that is their impression. Porn is their impression of what an intimate relationship looks like, and some porn is very violent also, and this is where they're getting their information from. So we must work on sex education, on compulsory good sex education in schools, and porn should be one of the topics that the educators must be telling these children, really, and teenagers, that what you are seeing in porn is not the reality. It is not what an intimate relationship looks like. And also there's the issue of expectations, and that if they don't rise to those expectations, they are inadequate, they are no good, they cannot be loved, they cannot have an intimate relationship. I feel very strongly about this, and thus about serious sex education, which in its absence can many times also lead to sexual violence, which some girls and young women tend to accept, because that is where they're getting their sex education from, and it becomes acceptable. So it's a very, very serious situation.
Certainly, any truly serious, as you put it, comprehensive sexuality education program must absolutely include equipping young people to deal with their own contemporary digital reality, give them literacy to navigate what is out there for themselves. And it is absolutely crucial that all initiatives that aim to combat gender-based violence need to have this strong prevention component. And education is totally essential in that regard. So let's have a deeper look at how this actually works in practice in Sweden. Amanda, how exactly are you working towards improving access to this kind of crucial information and life skills among young people in Sweden?
So the RFSU's work is really focused on using sexual health promotion as a method for implementing real change and real comprehensive sexual education. And sexual health promotive work is kind of the core of our organization, and it's present in our comprehensive sexuality ed classes, our lectures, our panel discussions, and our education initiatives among teachers and professionals. And sexual health promotion as a method really ties into the power of information along with sex positivity. So promotive work in practice means giving information about what kind of sexual and reproductive rights everyone is entitled to, along with incorporating discussions on social norms and how they affect our perceptions and limitations of what gender, sexuality, and sex itself means. And in a lot of promotive work, as opposed to using purely violence prevention as a method, we also put a lot of effort into discussing what good relationships and good communication looks like. Because if we only give examples of what not to do, what's bad, students tend to be left confused on how to act right. And our research on sexual health promotion also shows that a positive view of sexuality is central for sex education to be perceived as relevant by students and to really answer their questions on sexuality. And getting into like practice details, we have a wide set of different sexuality education classes, but our standard class, or BOSPAS in Swedish, is a complement to the school's own sexuality education programs. And in under 2 hours, our CSE teachers provide knowledge and lead discussions and dialogues with students on topics such as social norms, sexuality, gender identity, reciprocity, pornography, STIs, and safer sex, condom use, and like practical tips on different kinds of sexual practices, like how do you have sex, how can you have sex. And my personal experience with working as a CSE teacher is a very positive one. The generation that's now in the middle and upper secondary school is one that really values respect, consent, and the right to one's sexuality and body if you only give them the tools to do this. And I really love the work because they are very wise. It's really seldom that I face any resistance from them. And if I do, it almost ends in a really good discussion where they learn something new from each other and the world. And there are, however, natural constraints to being a nonprofit CSE teacher. We only visit them once or twice per year in a school setting. And even though we can start a conversation about these issues, it's really the teachers that have to do the real dirty work. And unfortunately, that's where we most often face skepticism and resistance to our methods. Because even though a majority of teachers really appreciate our presence at their schools, I've absolutely faced teachers who think we shouldn't talk about these issues in the way that we do.
Amanda, you're clearly very dedicated in doing that work. And what you've outlined there shows us that this really can be done. There are different routes to reaching young people in schools, out of schools. You have a clear vision for how these various actors in young people's lives need to be working together to ensure that young people are getting this right information, and that it is totally possible with the right framework to deliver education that gives young people the skills to understand consent and equality and respect for personal boundaries in a curricula that embeds a positive view of sexuality for them. And so we have this very, very clear way forwards. It's possible to do it, you're doing it, and yet access across Europe is still a lottery. It is completely based on where young people live or go to school. And we know that some EU countries are going out of their way to deny young people these vital life skills. Hungary's move this week has not happened in isolation. Poland also comes to mind, where we've seen relentless attempts to criminalize sexuality education. Helena, in this context, it's extremely promising to hear about these EU strategies and the planned directive that should help promote access to sexuality education. Having listened to Amanda tell us a bit more about the delivery of sexuality education and how it happens at local and national level in Sweden, what other practices do you hope to see other EU countries take up in terms of education as a way to fight inequalities and prevent violence?
Well, we consider SRHR to be at the core of gender equality. So it's a very important area of policy for us. And sexuality is an integral part of human life. But as you rightly point out, it is still taboo in some societies. And that is the big problem that we have. But we must break these taboos and the personal restraints these taboos bring about. And we do this with comprehensive and reliable information, as well as education about sexuality and relationships to all children and to all young people. The right to knowledge will help children and young people to take informed decisions, as Amanda was pointing out, consent and all that, and empower them early on to take control of their bodies and to develop respectful human, social, and sexual relationships. So it benefits children and society as a whole, as we do not discuss openly gender stereotypes and bias, gender-based violence, early and unplanned pregnancies, HIV, and other sexually transmitted infections. So we have to do all this in order to break these taboos. I think that there's a lack of awareness, so therefore that's a serious risk to health and to well-being. But we know that teaching about sexuality in schools is a sensitive issue. And also this backlash against providing mandatory sexuality education in schools, for instance, and spreading of disinformation about comprehensive sexuality education, which creates fear and creates confusion. So we must, above everything else, dispel the myths about sexuality education. And it does not deprive parents of their choice to educate their children according to their values and to their beliefs. And it is always adapted to the age of the child or young person. So there is no one size fits all. That is important when it comes to the curriculum. A lot depends on the age of the child and of the young person. And I think that the benefits of having good sexual education goes beyond. The benefits go far beyond, because it encourages respectful and healthy relationships, promotes respect for diversity and human and fundamental rights. It helps combating gender stereotypes, violence and abuse against children and women, and discrimination. And you said it in the beginning, if there is more education, there will be less violence, and definitely that is the case. And it helps also, sex education helps to combat homophobia and transphobia, especially, and not only in school. What we are teaching in school stays forever with our children. I mean, children of school age are of a very impressionable age. So what is impressed upon them at such a young age will we all remember very much what we learned when we were children and teenagers, because that is the most impressionable age, and this is where we have to work. So, and it creates also a safer and more inclusive learning environment for all of us. So this is an area, I have to say, where the EU has limited competence, but we support those member states that want to advance in this area. And not only that, we speak all the time, as I am doing here today, about the importance of sexual education. I think it is of the essence, and I want to work hard so that every member state has a good level of sex education, because the implications of not having good sexual education are very, very, very negative.
Well, indeed, we are seeing more and more evidence being published that links the provision of sexuality education with reduction in the harms associated with homophobia, transphobia, and all forms of SGBV. So we really have to wake up to the fact that if we deny young people comprehensive sexuality education, we are knowingly denying them the chance to live safer lives. So it's fantastic to hear your dedication to embracing comprehensive sexuality education as a key part of young people's development and of creating a safer and more inclusive environment for everybody in society. I've got one final question for each of you. Amanda, what is the one change in the world that you would most like to see happen today to increase the impact of the work that you are doing?
I would like to see an increased knowledge sharing in the field of sexuality education, as well as improving the scope of school programs and really investing in teacher training. And most importantly, following this up with solid evaluation efforts to make sure of the quality of our comprehensive sexuality education practices. So in other words, I wish to see a world where states actually use the vast knowledge that exists within nonprofit networks and make sure to take responsibility for the way that our comprehensive sexuality education is being practically implemented all the way out to the students in our classrooms. Because we need to together make sure that our SRHR and comprehensive sexuality education strategies not only remain on a regulatory level, but become practical reality in our schools and also in our healthcare facilities and our social services offices.
That's very clear. Thank you. Helena, what is the one action that you would like to see other EU decision makers embrace in order to make Amanda's wishes a reality?
I must say that I am exactly on the same page as Amanda, and I want to commend her for her work. She's doing a world of good, even beyond the teaching experience. The effect of her work will be felt by her students for the rest of their lives. So that's a very good investment in our youth. As I said earlier, the EU does not have much competence in this area of education, but we can still do a lot by taking the opportunity of, when presenting legislation, for instance, such as the legislation we shall be presenting on gender-based violence, to really include and speak about. I think it is the thing we should speak about most, education and sexual education, because that would be part of our prevention program. Sometimes it is too late for some people, and they say, had I known what I know now, or what had I known what my daughter is learning today, I would be in a much better place. So we shall use every opportunity, whether we come to the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, that we are not sure of yet. But what is for sure is that we will have our own legislation. We will take the opportunity to speak about and to have provisions in our legislation on what we have been speaking about today, and on the importance of sexual education, because people who ignore this, they do this without realizing the consequences of avoiding this subject will bring about to our societies, to our women and girls especially. So thank you for this opportunity to speak here today with you and with Amanda, and I hope that there will be more people like you and like Amanda who are spreading the word and who are pointing out to parents, to teachers, to societies, that this is definitely the way to go if we really want to. I never use the word eliminate violence against women, because I see it as something very far away. But if we sow the seeds of sexual education, I think we will reap much better futures, especially for our women and girls.
Thank you so much to both of our guests. We've heard how things are locally and nationally in Sweden, including some inspiring best practices in how Amanda works with young people to make sure that they feel empowered to take decisions about their lives and challenge harmful stereotypes and rigid gender norms. Amanda has underlined very clearly that it's not just about having a legal framework in place to ensure sexuality education is delivered. Implementation is crucial, and there needs to be investment in sustainable programs, training new educators and school teachers continuously, and ensuring that curricula for sexuality education are relevant, up to date, and that they reflect enough of a range of important life skills. We've heard from Commissioner Helena Dalli on the multiple EU frameworks that are meant to promote gender equality and protect European citizens from harm. We are especially eager to see the realisation of the new European Directive on Gender-Based Violence, and we will look to the European Parliament to adopt a strong report on this matter as well. Finally, we've also heard that there is a lot of power to prevent violence, to fight inequalities, and to adopt strong relationship and sexuality education programmes within the reach of individual EU countries themselves. This does require states to seize that responsibility and do the work, but it is also empowering to realise it's achievable. The data is out there, keen and willing educators are out there, a supportive international community of practice exists. It's entirely within the power of EU states to make the most of these resources and do their duty to ensure the safety of young people. As Helena said, this is the way to go. Thank you for joining us, and do look out for the next episode coming soon. This podcast series was commissioned by the International Planned Parenthood Federation, produced by Positive Stories, and funded by the Rights, Equality and Citizenship Programme of the European Union.